Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Go Beyond. My name is Alyssa Robinson, and I am here with Reverend Dr. Nick McRae.
Hey, everybody.
And Go Beyond is simply a time that we dig deeper into the message from Sunday. And this week, we were in the book of Esther, and I had some big questions about Esther. So you can see Pastor Nick brought 3 different Bibles with him to be able to explain some of the questions that I had about Esther. And so I hope that you will value this time. And I'm excited to just go ahead and jump right into my first question because I'm always fascinated by this.
Let's do it.
The book of Esther is the only book in the Bible that doesn't actually mention God. How do we make this connection to fasting and God in this book? And why was it even chosen to go into the Bible if it does not once mention God?
That's a very interesting question. Just a little note about the first part of your question. When you mentioned, I almost said Ruth, when you mentioned Esther being the only book of the Bible that doesn't mention God, there's actually a debate of whether it is the only book that doesn't. In fact, scholars debate one word in the book of the Song of Solomon about whether or not it mentions God or not. And it's a long story short, there's a Hebrew word that we don't exactly know what it means. And some people think that part of it is the name for God, and other people disagree and say that it's not. So depending on who you ask, Esther is either the only or one of the only two, right? So I just learned that a little while ago, so I just had to butt in to share that. But so what is this? How do we connect this with fasting and prayer, right, and God, and then why does Esther even appear in the Bible if it doesn't mention God? That's an excellent question, there's not a short answer for that. Which my favorite kind of questions are the ones that don't have short answers. So, essentially, there's a couple different factors going on here. One of them is that there are kind of multiple streams of versions of original versions of the Bible, if you will, interestingly. So the Protestant Bible is largely based on what's called the Masoretic text. Now, this was a Hebrew text of the Bible that was written, maybe 4 or 5, or kind of completed 400 or 500 years before the time of Jesus. Of course, the text had been written before then, but it was kind of solidified at that point, or maybe 300 to 400, anyway, a couple hundred years at least before Jesus. And that is basically what our Protestant Bibles are mostly based on. So Esther was included in that, in more or less the form that we get it. There are really kind of 2 other streams. There's another one called what scholars call the Alpha text, and this is another Hebrew version of the Bible from around the same time as the Masoretic text. That's just a little bit different. Most of the same stuff, but so the book of Esther in the Alpha text actually does mention God in several places, and these are from about the same time. So whichever people were kind of solidifying these and putting these manuscripts together just had some little different sources. The third one it's called the Septuagint. You may or may not have heard of this.
These are such big words.
Yeah,
we're going to need you to type this into the comments so that we know what these words look like.
Well, so I just brought this is an English translation of the Septuagint. It does have the Greek in here as well, but essentially it is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament from let's say 300 years before the time of Christ. Interestingly, it contains a lot more material than does the Masoretic text that our Bibles are based on usually. And so translations that are based on this one have more stuff. You may have heard of the Apocrypha. Essentially, the Apocrypha are books that were in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, that were not in the Hebrew Old Testament. And that's where that comes from. So that's why, for instance, the Roman Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox Church has more books in their Bibles because they are basing theirs on the Greek version. And a lot of the New Testament authors, when they're quoting from the Old Testament, of course, New Testament is written in Greek, and so a lot of times it appears to be that they too are quoting from this Greek version. So the Greek version of Esther is really, really interesting. So one of the things that most people note about the version of Esther in our Bibles is, God's never mentioned, nobody ever prays, right? The Greek, this is the one I want. The Greek version adds these long prayers from Mordecai and from Esther. And that's what will give you just a little bit of flavor of what that's like. And so, for instance, when Mordecai comes to Esther and tells her that this plot against the Jews and that she needs to go and save them, he has this long prayer, and then she responds with her own prayer. And it says this. Queen Esther also took refuge with the Lord in the mortal peril that had overtaken her. She took off her sumptuous robes and put on sorrowful mourning. Instead of expensive perfume, she covered her head with ashes and dung. She humbled her body severely, and the former scenes of her happiness and elegance were now littered with tresses torn from her hair. She besought the Lord God of Israel in these words, "My Lord, our King, the only one, come to my help, for I am alone and have no helper but you, and am about to take my life in my hands. I've been taught from my earliest years in the bosom of my family that you, Lord, chose Israel out of all the nations and our ancestors out of all the peoples of the old times to be your heritage forever, and that you have treated them as you promised." And she goes on to
that just gave me goosebumps.
Right? It's
like
beautiful.
That was visceral. Like the way she prepared for this prayer. And one of the things I mentioned to you before we started the conversation, it drives me crazy how little we hear from Esther in the book of Esther. And it's all these, my feminist rant, once again, all of these men making decisions about what this woman's life is going to be. And we don't even hear from her in the Protestant Bible until about chapter 8. Yeah. And I've never heard those words before.
Yeah, it's really kind of stirring to see it, because it changes the character of Esther, book of Esther, completely. And then if you go on to the scene where she does go to the king, I mean, it's completely. Probably don't have time to read this whole section, but it adds in so much detail about her going to the king and about her. With a delicate air, she leaned on the arm of her servant, while the other one, and it's really sort of like makes the scene dramatic. And the king is angry when he sees her, but then she swoons sort of, and the king, he's filled with compassion, and he goes and takes her in his arms. I mean, it's really kind of a romance in here too, and so it's really interesting. That it really does give her a more central place, although I would argue it makes her make her appear more of like a stereotypical damsel in distress. But so it's interesting. So you see, obviously, that the Greek versions of the Bible do have this very strongly religious character. But so then the question becomes, well, why does the version in our Bible not? Right? Why is it gone, and what does that mean? Most scholars would say that those sections, that the prayers and stuff are additions, or that they were people sort of maybe meditating on the text from the Hebrew and sort of filling in the gaps for us, what we imagine what would happen, So they're just saying, well, obviously she would have prayed. Obviously she would have sought God. Obviously the scene when she goes to the king, there would have been more kind of drama. So that's possible. I also think, I think that so the Hebrew version that we have that doesn't mention God, I think there's a few, I have a few thoughts about that anyway. So why do we even have a version that doesn't mention God? And then why would that be in our Bible? It's kind of the two remaining questions, I think. And I think one of the reasons we don't have it is, so I was reading kind of what some Jewish scholars were saying about Esther, and the sort of overarching proposal by the one scholar I was reading was basically saying, so rabbis have seen Esther for a long time as a comedy almost, right? I mean, there is some kind of humor to it in some ways, like the kind of bumbling king, Haman, the sort of the things that kind of happen to him, and then also that it's kind of it's actually kind of bawdy, if you will. I mean, there's all these feasts, there's this beauty contest that the king is taking all these beautiful young women into his chambers. I mean, it's an episode of Game of Thrones. It is absolutely an episode of Game of Thrones. And so this one Jewish scholar is basically saying, it's possible that those who were writing this and editing the book of Esther, they might not have wanted the name of God associated with that, not because the book itself was bad, but because they took the name of God very seriously. And it was very serious. Like people may know that in the Jewish tradition, you don't say the name of God. You don't write the name of God. I mean, different people, some people will even nowadays, they'll type G-D even in an email or something like that, because they take the name of God very seriously. And so one scholars would say, well, because of the content of this book, not that it's necessarily any bawdier than other parts of the Bible, but that could be a reason why someone would take it out. That's possible, or why I would not include it. That's possible. I also think it's interesting to think about this text as, this is kind of like real life in some ways. And like we don't in some of the Old Testament books, we do get there's big obvious miracles and big obvious displays of God's power, lightning and voices from beyond, but we don't get any of that in Esther. And a lot of the contemporary commentators I've read have picked up on that and said, that's kind of what our life is like. We don't usually see the big flashing lights and the big flashing stuff. We just have to, we trust God, and we sort of act just having faith that God is going to be with us. And so in some ways that is more realistic to, at least to our experience. However, the question relates, well, why don't they pray at least or mention God? And, I was reflecting on that and thinking, honestly, Mordecai and Esther are not super they're not super devout Jews. They just aren't. They hide the fact that they're Jewish all through the story. There may be good reasons for that, maybe not. I mean, obviously there's a plot later in the story, but at the beginning there doesn't seem to be. So they hide the fact that they're Jews. Esther's married to a Gentile. Now, she probably didn't really have any say in that, which is another thing, but nonetheless, she's married to a Gentile. We assume because she's hiding her identity that she's eating, foods that are not allowed, all kinds of stuff. They're not, maybe they may or may not be super pious Jews. The thing is, though, when we look at the book of Esther in the context of all of Scripture, I think that what Esther shows is that God is taking care of the people even when they don't reach out to him, is the thing. Now, it may not be an easy application for us to then say, okay, well, I can be like Esther, but although the thing is, there is a lot to admire in her. But it's not necessarily a one-to-one thing, right? That we can and should turn to God in prayer. But even when these folks are not doing those things, God has a plan for the Jewish people. And as Christians, we say that plan ultimately is going to include Jesus coming from the Jewish people. And if they're wiped out, obviously, then how can that happen? So God's going to make a way for that. And one final little thing about that, I would say, is that when they fast, my question, I also think prayer is assumed in fasting. Now, I don't know a ton about fasting in the ancient world, except for what's in the Bible. But what else would be the purpose of fasting? So I wonder if also it's just assumed that this fasting, even if the name of God is not mentioned for any number of reasons, when they are fasting, they're hoping to achieve something by that. They're doing it for a reason, not just, there's all other ways to show grief or whatever, but why else would she say, fast with me? What would it do if not to be a way of going before God? So that's a lot of different ideas all crammed together.
I love it. Yeah, I love these kinds of conversations. I know we've spent a huge amount of time on this first question, which means we might not get through the second two, but I have found the book of Esther fascinating for so long because of all of the reasons that you walked through. And one of the things that you mentioned to me earlier is that people have compared Esther to Christ. Mm-hmm. And I've never considered that. And I've never considered, the point that you made of even when you're not chasing after God, God is chasing after you.
Yeah. I like your language for it better. That's way better than what I said.
And so all of those things, I can read this book over and over and over again. And then I was also thinking when you were saying, well, maybe they didn't want God included because of the content. I was like, oh, maybe the same for Song of Solomon. Right. It's pretty risque.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's a whole other conversation, but yeah.
We won't get into that. So the next question I wanted to ask you is more personal because Esther was turning to God, was fasting, and a lot of it was because she was feeling afraid, going to the king, and basically, potentially she could be killed and struck down because she was breaking laws by going to him unsummoned and, all of these things. And so she was basically entering that under the idea of I'm sacrificing myself to save my people. Mm-hmm. Which is I cannot imagine how fearful she was going into that moment. So I wanted to ask you, when was a time that you've turned to God when you were afraid? Can you give us a specific time?
For sure, yeah. So I was reflecting on this and I was thinking, at the beginning, maybe it was really about a year ago right now when the sort of, the lockdowns had just begun for the coronavirus pandemic, and there was lots of stuff going on. And that was just one layer. I mean, that's probably the most serious layer. But in addition, there's a lot of other stuff going on in my life. I knew that I was going to be moved from my church where I was serving previously to somewhere else. That would probably involve moving our house as well. We were living in Richardson at the time. We had no idea where we were going to be. And there were these long periods of time where it's kind of, the pandemic's going on. My wife had lost her job during the pandemic too. And so I had a part-time job, but it's basically, we had my part-time job and we were knowing we were going to have to move. And I didn't know where I was going to have to go. I have no control in our system over like where I'm appointed. We sort of trust God that our leaders know what they're doing to put me where they will be. I had no idea I was going to be at Treach. That was a time of extreme uncertainty, and then compounded with the fear of we have this worldwide pandemic that we don't know how serious it is. At that time, the experts were telling us it was bad in reality, but at that time they were saying, we don't really know how bad this is going to be. This could be like millions and millions of people could die. Everyone's vulnerable. It was a scary time for a lot of people. So that was a time when I really leaned into to relying on God, because the fact of the matter was I realized there's nothing I could do. All I could do was just stay home. I would take these long prayer walks every day around our neighborhood, just kind of get out of the house. And I prayed a lot Jesus' words from Garden of Gethsemane, where he says, after saying, God, if it's possible, if you take this cup from me, but then he says, but your will be done, or your will and not mine be done. And so that became my prayer. But God, your will, O Lord, be done. After everything that I would pray, because I was scared. I didn't know, and then I had no idea how it was going to turn out. And yet, God was faithful, and
do you think that
going.
During that time you felt like you received God's strength? Because this week our focus was on fasting for strength, turning to God for strength. What did that feel like for you? What does it feel like to receive God's strength? And I'm guessing it's different for every person.
I think it's different for every person. It's different for every situation, because sometimes the strength you need something different. Sometimes you need the strength to and the motivation to get up and do something, right? Like Esther did. Other times you need the strength to stop trying to do something. Like with me, going through these scenarios, going through my minds of how can I make our future so that I can have some control over it, and just realizing I have no control in this moment, and that's okay. So for me, I recall moments of, and this is true in other times as well, strength from God. It felt like peace. And it's that, we read in Philippians about the peace of God that passes all understanding. I believe, experienced that. In fact, Jesus says, Paul says in Philippians chapter 4, starting verse 6, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and pleading with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension or understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And I did experience that, because I remember being, I'd be all tied up in knots, and after some time, through prayer, and I could eventually find that I was able to let go a little. I can't control this. I can't do anything right now. But I know that everything's going to be okay. And I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know what's going to happen in 5 minutes or tomorrow, but I know that it's going to be okay. And I know that was a gift from God. That's one of those moments where I'm like, that shift doesn't just happen. It doesn't happen every time I pray, but there have been those powerful moments. It's like, I am strong enough to do nothing and be okay with that. So.
Yeah, and I think it's, because I've experienced the same thing, where the feeling of God's strength is peace and calm, and this just quiet confidence and assurance that everything's going to be okay.
Yep.
But I think sometimes, much like the Jewish people did, with the expectation of Christ is going to come in like a warrior and swoop in and save us. That's what we expect God's strength to feel like, is just armor up and power through it, and we can feel like we can do anything. But I've personally found it to be the opposite of it's okay to do nothing. Yeah, God will take care of it.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that as you're saying that, I'm imagining a story about Elijah. He's in the wilderness. He's on the run for his life. He goes up onto a mountain. He goes in a cave, and he says that there was this great earthquake. Right, the rocks were shaking, the mountains were splitting. He said, but he said God wasn't in the earthquake, and he said there was a great wind blowing, but God wasn't in the wind, and there was lightning or fire. God wasn't in the fire, and then there was, as some translations say, a still small voice, or a lot of translations just say a deep silence. And it said, and God, or the implication being that God was in that silence. So sometimes it is that calm peace. I'd love the fireworks every time. We don't usually get the fireworks, and that's okay.
That's okay.
Esther and Mordecai didn't get the fireworks. But they could look back on that and say, look at all these things that happened and all these unlikely, God was in that. Yeah. And a lot of times it is hindsight as well, when you can reflect on what you've been through and say, if not for God, no, there's no way.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. We went a little longer than we normally do today, but I think it was well worth it. It was a great conversation. I appreciate you stepping in this week while Daniel was off.
Thanks for asking.
So thank you, everybody, for joining us for Go Beyond. And as always, you can catch all previous episodes of Go Beyond at tmumc.org/Go Beyond. So thank you, and we will see you next week.
Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Oh, yeah. Happy St. Patty's Day.